Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. In a previous video, I talked about the logic of Tawheed and how breaking down concepts logically, getting to the root of them, they often reduce down to manyness and oneness, or sameness and difference as kind of the last concept to go before you sort of before logic reaches the end of its leash, in a sense. So it's not that we're giving up on logic, we're not being irrational. It's rather that we're realizing the limits of logic. And I just wanted to give another example of how when we push concepts and interrogate them, they all do break down and kind of meet at, you could say they meet at the source, which is Allah himself. But again, because the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, do not ponder upon Allah, ponder upon his creation. We can ponder upon his attributes, etc., but we can't actually get to the essence of Allah, because like I said, it's just, at least we can't logically reflect upon that. We try to be in a state of worship and awareness and in wonderment of that, but that's for another time. Anyway, I wanted to get just another example to just a little bit more concrete example, I suppose, of, since oneness and manyness is maybe a little bit of an abstract place to start. So I just wanted to talk about something like nature versus will, for instance. So nature we tend to associate with, nature is like what makes something what it is inevitably, or it's like part of its definition. So, and we would think of like a rock, for instance, as behaving according to its nature, whereas an animal or a human behaves by will. We make choices, we want to do things. And so, will is generally associated with animate beings, and nature is what rules inanimate beings, or even you could say to a degree like humans have more will. This is how we typically think of it. Humans have more of a will, but animals, especially lower animals, act not according to a will, but more according to their nature. Like to us, their behavior is more predictable, and nature is seen as kind of like, inherent, inevitable, not chosen, etc. Whereas will is more willful, conscious, etc. And humans, we have a nature as well, of course, and they can be in conflict. They can, it's part of my human nature, or say it's part of my will. I wish I could swing through the trees like a spider monkey. But as a human, my nature is that, I'm not quite that strong or agile or what have you. And my arms aren't long enough. So I won't be able to do that, unfortunately. I can do a little bit, but not as good as a spider monkey. Come on. But when it comes to when we think of Allah, so there's two ways to kind of break down concepts, or sort of realize how they fall apart, I guess. One way is to sort of try to perfect them. And so when we think of like if Allah has the perfect nature and the perfect will, well, the perfect will is a will that is unconstrained, can choose anything. Allah is all powerful, so he is unconstrained. So it's and so if he were to have a nature, it would be of his own choice. So it's like the distinction kind of ceases to make sense at that point, because like the perfect nature is like, or maybe the perfect nature you could think of as being like it's completely, and I guess this is kind of how the ancients would have thought, is like the nature is completely unchanging, and people and different philosophy, like the theologians tended to go toward the will side of things and think Allah is like pure will, whereas philosophers almost I don't know, it's probably not right to say they went the other way, but they kind of gave Allah this sort of inevitable, like, the perfect nature. He only does one thing. He doesn't really choose things. He just sort of like emanates inevitably. He's perfected. Their idea of perfection was just like this unchanging, eternal thing that only does the one perfect action of like emanating meaning like sort of shining out like a light. The different layers of the cosmos, the different layers of it. That's a whole thing. But anyway, so the so, but when we really think about it, having, if Allah is all powerful and has the perfect will, yeah, it's unconstrained. And there are some hadith that kind of like point to this. So like the hadith Qudsi, where Allah says, I have ordained upon myself that my mercy will overcome my wrath. So it's like Allah is choosing His own nature. But yeah, so it's pointing to the fact that kind of this distinction kind of breaks apart. Then if we go kind of the other way and we try to break those concepts down and think, well, first we'll do it in kind of we can do it in a, well, if we do it, there's a couple different ways we could do it. We could do it in a sort of, if we do it in a more kind of just logical way, in the sense of getting to the essences of those qualities. Yeah. So if we, okay, so from a scientific perspective, how would we break down those concepts or understand what they are, or how we define them? Really, yeah, perfect the definitions maybe. And it would be kind of like, well, if we can't just say, if we can't, and we're trying to not be circular, or we're trying to define them in terms of other things, which that's maybe one of our hints there. But will, when we try to break down, well, what is will, what is nature, if we can't assume, so will is usually, the difference seems to be this like quality of predictability. So like nature seems to be things that are more predictable, whereas will is unpredictable. But actually then I think if we really kind of think holistically about it, what it comes down to is actually like predictable and unpredictable things can happen to any object or living creature, what have you. But when we talk about will, the unpredictability is like we see it as internal to the creature. Whereas when it's nature, if it's something nature, it's like, sure, different conditions could be unpredictable. A rock could fall into a river of lava and melt and be destroyed. But the rock itself behaves very predictably throughout that. Whereas like, a living creature sitting even in predictable conditions externally could do something unexpected. Or we can't predict what it's going to do. So, I guess breaking it down, you kind of do get to this sort of thing. Well, okay, so how do we define how do you define internal versus external? It's like, well, those are, how do you determine what's part of an object versus not part of an object? It's, a correlation, a statistical correlation of, well, all these parts are rarely separate. They're generally together. They, so it comes down to, again, like a sort of statistical analysis, or a statistical trait, and the, so like it's not really, and then you kind of get to the point where it's like, well, I guess it's not really anything about the thing itself, because it's just about where the unpredictability is compared to like our perspective as what we are. So the concepts become very relational. They become very, like, the more you dig into them, the more you realize they sort of depend on each other. They depend on perspective, depend on how you define things. What time scales are we talking about? Blah 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 blah. And so it just, the dichotomy breaks down. It becomes that when you really get to the essences of these things, they're, again, like, to talk in sort of physics terms or something, it's, at the end of the day, it's all information, right? And what is information? It's sameness and difference, right? It's it brings us right back to the ancient Platonic concept, or another way we might be able to think of it, and I didn't think this through before, so it's a little bit of a risk. What was I thinking? Yeah, if you try to take on like a nominalist perspective, which I think is it's a way of thinking, I suppose. You sort of, so nominalist meaning like you don't believe patterns are real, or like sameness and difference, because sameness and difference is kind of like a relative, like it requires comparison, which is an act of a third party essentially, between, to say these two things are the same or these two things are different requires a third party to like interact with it. So any particular thing in itself is actually, you can't even say anything about it. It's sort of, which then that resembles the essence of the one again. It's like this, it's like the one again, you sort of like, if you try to find things as they are in themselves and seek no relation, it takes on these qualities that resemble, are reflections of the one. And so, that's why I think the Quran says, فَأَيْنَمَا تَوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. We're seeing these attributes of Allah sort of playing out, or being reflected in creation, and yeah, seeing how you can either and yeah, how like when we talk about theology, we're learning things. We're actually learning things about like everything, like all, like being itself is just sort of the topic, I suppose, or rather, yeah, in the course of discussing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God Almighty, you end up sort of discovering things about being itself, because you're sort of trying to get at the core of reality. And so, okay, so will and nature, where was I with that? Oh, and then just talking in more of like a practical level. Right, so the dichotomy can break down, and you realize, yeah, for instance, another way of looking at it is sort of like, well, okay, I'm, if it's human, couldn't you say that human nature is to have will? Because if humans have a nature, as in like what makes a human being, what's the definition? It's like clearly it is to have a will. Any living thing, or any, presumably any living thing that can move, and or even, yeah, I mean, we could at least anything that can move clearly has some sort of will, like it has a desire to move, etc. It has teleological behavior, goal-oriented behavior. So that is its nature, right? So again, it's like, if the nature of something is to have will, then again, the distinction ceases to make sense. And there's kind of I guess I'll speak briefly to, the kind of, there's kind of there's a tendency, there's a sort of nihilistic tendency when people think, oh, I guess we're actually not, this will / nature distinction doesn't make sense. I guess we are really just atoms, and but then you could also, but that's like, I think the response to this is that, well, why are you looking down on the atoms? And I think, well, I think the anxiety is that people think, okay, if I am just atoms, then my free will is an illusion, and I don't actually have any choice. And I think that's kind of incoherent ultimately, which maybe I can focus on that issue for another video. But suffice it to say for the moment that, like, just from a scientific perspective, I mean, we clearly are very different from a toaster. Like, I don't. If the anxiety is that, like, oh, I'm ultimately not different from a toaster, which maybe, yeah, I think is actually true, but like, why? But clearly, we have a lot of very practical, real differences from a toaster or a rock or what have you. So, like, what are we really, like? Should we really be anxious about that? And then also the question is like, why are you looking down on atoms? Like, what do you mean just atoms? Like, of course the atoms are amazing. Like, we don't even understand what's going on with atoms. And if you look at, there's a very big kind of parallel between, if you look at quantum mechanics, you can very accurately sort of give statistics about, okay, if you splatter these photons or particles or what have you through this slit, okay, 5% of them will land in this area, 5% in this area. You can, on a grand scale, on a large scale, you can accurately give statistics about the particles, but you can't predict the behavior of any one particular particle. Same with human beings. You can give actuarial tables about such and such percentage of people will get in a car crash this year, so certain percentage of people will have heart disease or what have you, but you can't use those statistics to predict the behavior of one particular human. And so yeah, so it's like, well, people might think, oh, I guess we're not that different for as we study things, it turns out that we're a lot more like rocks than we thought. But then you could also say on the same page, from just flip it, you could just say, well, it turns out rocks are actually a lot more like us than we thought. So it's kind of like, the this sort of nihilistic, atheistic, not that those are necessarily the same, but just to speak broadly, the sort of nihilistic, atheistic way of thinking, and the sort of like spiritual, uh, uh, joyful, panpsychist kind of way of thinking, where you're like, oh, everything is alive and conscious, even, like those two, like if you do them properly, they are actually not really that different from each other in terms of their actual content. It's almost more just like, what is your state in that? What's your emotional orientation to it? Are you like, oh, I guess I'm just atoms, oh man, or are you like, whoa, I'm atoms, and like the atoms, like every being is, made up of other beings, and we're all, and consciousness is flying everywhere, and they're not, of course, I don't think atoms are like talking to each other or thinking or doing math or what have you, but clearly there's a lot of analogies going on. It's kind of like, how history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. It's kind of like the fractal structure of the universe, the different scales. It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. um, and so, in the Quran says that all the things that, every creature in the heavens and the earth, and everything that walks on the earth and flies through the sky, etc., they're like you. I mean, they're nations like you. So there's kind of a panpsychist-ish view presented in the Quran. And um, and the other thing, I guess, is, again, so like, سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. So Allah in the Quran says that we will show them our signs in the horizons and in themselves, until it becomes clear to them, until it becomes evident to them that it is the truth, presumably the revelation, or perhaps you could read it as yeah. I think that seems to be the more kind of straightforward reading. Or some people will say like "Annahul haq" means that Allah is the reality or something like that. But anyway, the yeah, how these are all signs of, yeah, of how, uh, uh, yeah, it's all signs everywhere. Signs all the way down, all the way up and all the way down. And yeah, it's just about cultivating that state of the worshiper, uh, um, to benefit from it. What is it? What's the hadith? There's a saying of the Prophet. I don't want to get the vowel. I always forget the voweling. What is it? Ajaban, ajaban lihal al-mu'min. How wondrous is the state of the believer. Like if something bad befalls them, they're patient and rewarded, and if something good for them, they're grateful. And it's just like, yeah, that's the state you want to be in, so that you're not just atoms, but you're like, Allah, your spirit is coming down. It was blown into clay, and here I am.